Thank you, Professor Pu, for your kind introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Qing CHENG from Nanjing University. Today is my great honor to have the presentation today. My presentation is about effects of microstructure on desiccation cracking of a compacted soil. This is outline. The presentation mainly consists of 5 parts. First is a background. With global climate change, more frequent and longer lasting drought may appear in some regions in the future and even exceed a critical threshold for human adaptability. Responding to drought, soil desiccation cracking as a natural phenomenon is projected to be intensified, especially in the arid and semi-arid regions. The development of cracks can have a significant influence on the mechanical and hydraulic properties of the soils, leading to a variety of geotechnical and geological engineering problems. For example, in the pavement engineering, the desiccation cracking in the subsoil can have a negative influence on the long-term serviceability of the roadways and endangers the safe and quality rights for the traveling public. In slope engineering, the desiccation cracking may increase the risk of rainfall infiltration and further reduce the factor of safety of the slope. And in landfill engineering, the desiccation cracking in barrier soils may result in a more serious rainfall infiltration and landfill gas emission, further contaminating the surrounding groundwater and air. In the past few decades, many researchers have paid attention to investigate the various influencing factors of the desiccation cracking of soils. The influencing factors can be separated into 2 main groups: the soil internal factors and the external environmental factors. The internal factors include like the mineral composition, fine contact, water retention characteristics, tensile strength, size, and thickness of the soil samples. While like temperature, boundary condition, relative humidity, and wetting drying cycles, and other external environmental factors also affect the desiccation cracking behavior. In most of the previous studies, the experiments were conducted on the slurry samples. However, in terms of the engineering practice, compacted soils are more often used as construction materials. Based on this background, the principal objective of this study is to investigate the effects of different microstructure induced by various compaction water contents on the desiccation cracking behavior of a compacted soil. The testing material is Xiashu soil taken from Nanjing, China. According to the ASTM standard, it can be classified as a lean clay. And in this study, 5 soil samples are compacted with 5 different water contents. 2 samples are compacted on the dry side, and 1 sample compacted at the optimum water content, and another 2 samples were compacted on the wet side. After compaction, the soil samples were subjected to saturation and then the sand drying process. The pore size distributions of each soil sample is characterized by performing the MIP test. The change in water content and the evolution of the surface crack pattern during the drying process are continuously monitored in the test. The images taken by the digital camera were analyzed using the software crack image analysis system developed by Nanjing University. First of all, the image pre-processing, including the mineralization, denoising, smoothing, skeletonizing, and crack identification and clot identification. Then the next step is about the quantitative analysis, and we can get the geometric indexes like the length and width of each crack segment, angle of each intersection, and some general indexes like the number of the intersections and crack segments, and average crack length, average crack width, surface crack ratio, and also the statistical indexes like the probability density function of crack length, crack width, and intersection angle. And then I will show you some main results of the experiment. The figure on the left-hand side shows the pore size distributions obtained from the MIP test. We can find that for the soil samples compacted on the dry side and at the optimum water content, bimodal pore size distributions with two distinct pore domains can be observed, which means both the micropores and the macropores can be detected by the MIP technique. This is because for the soil samples compacted on the dry side and at optimal water content, the clay particles assemble together and the aggregate structure is well developed. However, we can find that for the soil samples compacted on the wet side, the pore size distributions show a unimodal form. This is attributed to the assembly of the clay particle matrix around the silt grains and the gradual formation of a dispersed structure. Moreover, a simple microstructure state variable is adopted to quantitatively describe the microstructure of the samples. It can be found that with the increasing compaction water content, the microstructure state variable increases, which means a less aggregated structure of the clay particles. And this slide shows the crack initiation and propagation of each soil sample. For the soil samples compacted on the dry side and at the optimal water content, we can find that the crack initiate evenly on the soil surface and then widens gradually. The initiation of the cracks occurs randomly and almost at the same time on the surface of soil sample. This is because the cracks usually initiate at the surface defects where shrinkage distortion or stress concentration occurs. For the soils with aggregate structure, the macropores between the aggregates has a larger pore size, leading to a higher strength energy prior to cracking. Thus, the places between the aggregates can be regarded as surface weak zones, resulting in the crack initiation. Moreover, we can find from the pictures that several crack initiation points appearing almost simultaneously. And from one crack initiation point, the three cracks propagate in three directions with an angle of 120 degrees, resulting in a Y-shaped crack intersection. And this can be explained by adopting the concept of the Griffith's fracture energy balance. The Y-shaped crack intersection is the most energy efficient, where the crack length required is minimum for expanding the same amount of energy. And the crack propagation manner of the soil samples compacted on the wet side with a dispersed, which is more similar to that of the slurry samples investigated by previous researchers. We can find that the primary cracks initiate first and the subcracks initiate at the existing primary cracks and almost perpendicular to the primary cracks. This is because this can be explained by adopting the maximum stress release criterion. When the primary cracks initiate, the internal tensile stress perpendicular to the existing primary cracks are released, and the newly maximum tensile stress is parallel to the existing primary crack. Thus, the subcracks grow at the local maximum tensile stress, which are perpendicular to the primary cracks. Then I will show you some quantitative results, and this figure shows the change of the surface crack ratio with water content during drying. It can be found that the cracking water content, which means the water content when the first crack initiates, the cracking water content of the samples compacted on the dry side and at the optimum water content is higher than those of the samples compacted on the wet side. This is because the cracks in the samples compacted on the dry side and at optimum water content appears in the void between aggregates, while the cracks in the samples compacted on the wet side appears in the void between the soil particles. The larger pore diameter develops smaller section, resulting in a higher amount of water retained in the soil. As a result, a higher cracking water content can be observed for the soil samples compacted on the dry side. Moreover, we can also find that during drying, the surface crack ratio of all the samples show an increasing trend. Specifically for the soil samples compacted on the dry side and at the optimum water content with bimodal pore size distributions, the surface crack ratio increases almost linearly with the decreasing water content. This is because for these samples, all the cracks initiate at the same time and the generated cracks gradually widen with further drying. However, which is differently for the soil samples compacted on the wet side with unimodal pore size distributions. The relationship between the surface crack ratio and the water content can be regarded as two approximately linear segments, right? The changing rate of the first segment is much smaller than the second one. The first segment can be corresponding to the initiation of the primary cracks and subcracks. And the second segment corresponds to the widening of existing cracks after the geometric crack pattern tends to stabilize. The evolution of the crack density of each soil sample during the drying process has a similar trend. Based on the above-mentioned phenomenon, the crack propagation of soil samples with an aggregated structure and with a dispersed structure show different manners. And this slide provides a schematic view. For the soil samples with an aggregated structure, the cracking propagation can be summarized into two stages. First of all, the independent Y-shaped cracks between the aggregates initiate evenly on the soil surface with soil shrinkage during the evaporation. And these cracks extend gradually until reaching the edge or intersecting with each other. And the geometric structure of the crack pattern is formed. And then the geometric structure of the crack pattern tends to be stabilized when the water content continues to decrease and the existing cracks keep widening until the desiccation ceases. For soil samples with a dispersed structure, desiccation cracking takes place, can be summarized into three stages. Firstly, during the drying process, water evaporates and soil shrinks.
You have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Independent cracks between the soil particles initiate at the inner surface or the edge and propagate until reaching the edge or intersecting with each other. And these initial independent cracks are considered as the primary crack. And then perpendicular to the existing primary cracks, some thin cracks initiate and propagate. These thin cracks are regarded as subcracks. Both the primary cracks and the subcracks form the geometric structure of the crack pattern. And the third stage is with further decreasing water content, the geometric structure of the crack pattern stays nearly unchanged, while the primary cracks and the subcracks widen until the desiccation ceases. And this slide shows the final crack pattern of each soil sample. We can find that there exist more fine and thin cracks in the soil samples with lower compaction water content. This represents that there are less weak zones exist in the soil sample with a higher compaction water content. In previous studies investigating desiccation cracking of slurry samples, the researchers get a common view that the crack segments are smooth and the soil surface is split into separate clots by the crack network. However, in our study, we find that the crack segments are rough and the clots of the compacted soil samples are not fully saturated. This can be attributed to the homogeneous structure of the slurry samples and the heterogeneous structure of the compacted soil samples. And the figure on the left-hand side shows the probability density function of the crack width of each soil sample at the end of the desiccation test. Generally, with increasing compaction water content, we can find that the probability density function of crack width changes from a unimodal form to a bimodal form, indicating that the grading characteristics of the primary cracks and subcracks becomes more obvious. In terms of the probability density function of the crack section angle, it is basically a normal distribution. Interestingly, we can find that for the soil samples compacted on the dry side and at the optimum water content, the intersection angles are mainly distributed in the range from 100 to 140 degrees. This corresponds to the observed phenomena that for soil samples with an aggregate structure, only primary cracks exist and they are formed at the same time at the beginning stage of the desiccation. And for the soil samples compacted on the wet side, with a dispersed structure, we can find that most of the intersection angle are in the range of 80 degrees to 100 degrees. And the peak value of the probability density function is at around 90 degrees. This corresponds to the observation that for the soil samples with a dispersed structure, the subcracks initiates after the formation of the primary cracks. The subcracks has intersections with an angle of about 90 degrees. And the last part is about the main conclusion. Due to the time limit, maybe no need to repeat it again. And that's all of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.